And welcome to our afternoon keynote at our inaugural W.E.B. Du Bois Data Science Symposium. But before I lend the mic over to him, I just wanted to share a couple of slides about the symposium and a huge amount of thanks for all of our participants today. It really has been a thought-provoking day, and I've much enjoyed the discussion. So this is our inaugural W.E.B. Du Bois Data Science Symposium, named after Du Bois, who was a professor here at Atlanta University and who pioneered work in data visualizations. And our upcoming speaker is going to give us a treat for these insights. So we are thankful to both the United Health Group and to Microsoft for supporting the Data Science Symposium. So just to let everybody know, we are recording and this will be posted on social media, and this is also live streamed on Facebook. You know, our Tommy Taylor, our communication specialist, makes sure everything goes well. So our community agreement is that we just remind everybody to use welcoming and inclusive language, be respectful of different viewpoints or experiences, and show courtesy and respect towards other members. So just before we get started, and I know some people are here at the symposium now and may not have been able to attend the beginning, so I just wanted to do a quick replay of our welcoming remarks from Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms and Congressman Jerry Mcnardy. Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms is the 60th mayor of Atlanta, and she's a phenomenal leader here in Atlanta, a graduate of an HBCU, Florida A&M University. And I, for one, am a big fan of her, not only for the work she's done here in Atlanta, but for really advocating for social justice through her service as a mayor.
Hello, I'm Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, and I am happy to welcome you to the inaugural W.E.B. Du Bois Data Science Symposium. Thank you to the Atlanta University Center Consortium for your efforts towards developing cutting-edge data science through research and scholarship. W.E.B. Du Bois once said, "The most important thing is to remember this, to be ready at any moment to give up what you are for what you might become." This past year, we've all witnessed the importance of science, and I believe its power provides the possibility of what you can discover and what you might create. Through his data science work, Du Bois told a story of resilience and perseverance, which speaks to the spirit of Atlanta, the AUC, and the HBCU community. As mayor, I'm committed to fostering the advancement of STEM in our communities and providing access to opportunities for our young people. I do hope that today's symposium will allow each of you time to reflect, share, and gather information that will help address some of the issues that we face each and every day in our communities. On behalf of the City of Atlanta, thank you for using your knowledge and research to shape our city and our nation. You make us so very proud.
We are thankful to Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms for her remarks. Next, we'll go for, again, we're doing a replay, but they're so great. We want to play Congressman Jerry Mcnardy's welcoming remarks. Congressman Mcnardy is a PhD mathematician who worked as an engineer in Sandia National Labs in New Mexico. He later worked as a senior engineer in harnessed wind energy, including manufacturing wind turbines. He also serves on the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, which oversees federal agencies such as NASA, National Science Foundation, NIST, and the Office of Science and Technology Policy. So we are thankful that he is here with us virtually.
Hello, this is Congressman Jerry Mcnardy, and I want to thank our hosts for giving me the opportunity to welcome you all to the inaugural W.E.B. Du Bois Data Science Symposium. As Congress's only PhD mathematician, I can see firsthand how the foundations created by Dr. Du Bois in the field of data science visualization have helped improve policymaking. From environmental justice and the disparate impact of climate change on vulnerable communities, to the harms of income inequality that stem from a system deliberately designed to disadvantaged specific groups. These injustices leave a lasting and measurable impact. To all of you who are here today, thank you for your continuing commitment to this work. For mathematicians, facts and figures always tell a story, but it's the work that you are engaged in that's bringing this important narrative to life for everyone to see. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you today. I look forward to hearing from many of you in the future about the important work you're undertaking. Thank you.
All right, so my name is Talitha Washington, if you didn't know. I'm the director of the Atlanta University Center Data Science Initiative. We work across Clark Atlanta University, Morehouse College, Morehouse School of Medicine, Spelman College, and the AUC Robert Woodruff Library. We work to facilitate, cultivate, and innovate in all things data science, both in research and in teaching. So just a quick few announcements. This summer, the AUC, we are hosting workshops for AUC faculty and graduate students, anywhere from genomics workshops to data visualizations and so on. So if you don't know about it, sign up for it. And as the young folks say, be about it. We also have a program coming up. It's called Open Doors by Open Source. This is for recent computing graduates. So this is to train the students in open source software development and giving them a leg up on entering into the high-tech industry. So if you know a student who would benefit from this, please send them our way. Also coming up this summer in July, we have a pre-freshman summer experience on data for social good. These are for incoming AUC students to have them be exposed and engaged in data science project. So if you know a student who would like to be involved, please send that their way. If you're an AUC faculty or staff member who would like to lead a research project, please stop by my virtual office. I have to give a huge thanks to our organizing team. Teamwork makes the dream work. Jerry Volsey, the Deputy Director of the Data Science Initiative, Bettina Gardner, the Administrative Director of the Data Science Initiative, Tommy Taylor, the Communications Specialist here at the Data Science Initiative, Judy Davis Carroll, who's the Chief Operating Officer at RH Bolton Incorporated, and Michael Jenkins, who's providing tech support with RH Bolton. Really, it takes this whole team to make this event work. And we really are happy that you all are here today. And we really look forward to engaging with you in future opportunities. But before I turn it over, I just have to remind us all that this month, April, is Math and Statistics Awareness Month. So I just want to wish everybody a happy April and that you keep going forward with your math, statistics, and data science. I also want to do a little side shout out to David Blackwell, who's the most published PhD mathematician and statistician. If you've heard of the Rao-Blackwell theorem, it's a theorem that often appears in many undergraduate statistics textbooks. Tomorrow he would be 102 years old, so I want to do a happy pre-birthday to David Blackwell. So now back to our regular agenda, so I don't digress too much. Our keynote speaker for this afternoon is Dr. Nathan Alexander. So Dr. Nathan Alexander is a teacher and researcher whose work integrates the computational sciences and social sciences in ways that speak to critical and historical traditions in education, especially among African-American communities. He grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, has worked as a teacher in Harlem. And in college, he worked as a teaching assistant in mathematics, as well with the Upward Bound program. He obtained his bachelor's degree at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and where he double majored in mathematics and sociology. I think, Dr. Alexander, you're a man after W.E.B. Du Bois's heart there. And he earned his master's in teaching mathematics from New York University. He also received a master's degree, master philosophy, and doctor philosophy in mathematics and education at Columbia University under the guidance of a friend of mine, Eric Walker. His specialties lie in mathematics education, statistical and mathematical modeling, and social networks and graphs. He has published on developments in teaching for social justice. In March of 2019, this may have come across your social media page, Dr. Alexander held one of his students' baby in class because the student had to bring the child to class, and Dr. Alexander, being the kind professor he is, he says, I can help out. And so that picture of him holding the baby while teaching mathematics went totally viral, and it also shows his love and compassion for his students. He's a Black History Month 2020 honoree awarded by Mathematically Gifted in Black. And we really look forward to hearing his talk that will examine the life and legacy of Du Bois that focuses on futurity in the use of data and science for racial justice. Dr. Alexander?
Hey, Dr. Washington, how's it going?
It's going great.
We all ready to go?
We are ready to go. Take it
Okay.
away, Dr. Alexander, the rising star.
First, I want to thank you, Dr. Washington, and just my colleagues, both at Morehouse College, Clark Atlanta, and Spelman College for their support over all the years. I've been in Atlanta for 4 years, and at Morehouse, it's just been a really wonderful experience. And so I'm going to share my screen here and we'll get started. I also want to thank my students, because a lot of the work that you're going to hear about today and some of the things that I'll talk about really come out of a lot of conversations with my students. And these include high school students across Atlanta schools and undergraduates at Morehouse College. And so, as Dr. Washington said, I'll speak a little bit about the life and legacy of Du Bois, and then we'll talk a little bit about something that people really don't know about Du Bois. You know, we know a lot about some of the data science work that's sort of increasing in popularity, but I hope today that you will leave with some interesting takeaways about some of his work in science fiction. And so just to give everyone a picture of what we're going to talk about today, we'll first start with some of the archival work that I've done, which is really looking across Du Bois's work from his birth until he moved to Ghana in 1963, and obviously his passing the night before the March on Washington. Then we'll talk a little bit about his historical and educational philosophies. And then I'll shift over to what I just said, some of his science fiction work and his work around futurity. And I'll talk about how I've used this work of Du Bois to really consider what it means to talk about interdisciplinary education. So we'll spend some time looking at the Black intellectual traditions, which were introduced by Manny Marable. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that I've done with Atlanta youth and how this has been informed by the life and legacy of Du Bois. Before we get started, though, I just want us to take a moment of silence. We've all been dealing with quite a bit socially, emotionally with the world this last year. In addition to COVID, we're also in the midst of a lot of racial violence. So my talk today really focuses on racial justice. So I just want to take a moment of silence. And I have this picture here by Hank Willis Thomas. It's called Rise Up. And I'll talk about that after just a moment of silence. I showed this image by Hank Willis Thomas because of its duality. And if we think about what Du Bois talked about with double consciousness, the greatness about this picture is you can't really tell what these individuals are doing. Are they raising their hands in a church service, or are they raising their hands in response to, say, police violence or being arrested or something? And so when we sort of think about the racial violence that's been experienced in our lifetime this year, but also since we look at history in the United States, one of the things that my students and I really focus on is how we can really think about the larger world in the field of mathematics. And so as a math educator, I often bring in images, art, history to really invoke sort of a spirit of community, but also a spirit of investigation. And we really think about using mathematics for things like social and racial justice. And so in terms of exploring the life of W.E.B. Du Bois, we'll look at his work on data science and some of the things that he's done in science fiction, but we'll also take an examination of a broader sort of picture of his transitions across his life. So where he started and how his philosophy evolved and what that philosophy and that evolution means for all of our work in life and specifically for an interdisciplinary education. And so here's just a big picture view of the life and work of W.B. Du Bois. So he was born in 1868 in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, and he died in 1963 after becoming a citizen in Ghana on the eve of the March on Washington. And so when we sort of think about the expansive work of what W.B. Du Bois has done, this is really life well lived. And when I think about education in the contemporary space, I think W.B. Du Bois is a really important case study for us to consider about education, interdisciplinary education, and specifically Black studies and Black education. We don't have time to focus on everything here, so instead we're going to look at just a few specific periods in Du Bois's life. We'll start with 1897, when he got to Atlanta University, which is now Clark Atlanta University, where he was a professor of history and economics. We'll then shift over to 1900, just a few years later, where he did a lot of the work that many of you may have seen with the data infographics and sort of visualizations and advanced statistical analyses. And then more interestingly, we'll talk about some of his writing that was never published. So the first thing is The Princess Steel. So we'll talk about the short science fiction story that Du Bois wrote and what it means sort of for the broad expansion of his life and his work. And then we'll look at the period between 1911 and 1928, talk about just his development and his evolving philosophy of education. And so let's start in 1897. So many of you may know, and if you don't, there was the American Negro Academy that was founded by Du Bois and many others. Those were John Wesley, Alexander Crummell, Paul Dunbar, Walter Hasten, and Kelly Miller, who was also a mathematician. And when they were founding the American Negro Academy, the goal was to promote the achievements of African Americans. So we sort of think about the period of time we're in the late 1800s. What is the role that intellectual study and education is playing in the life of African Americans who were recently emancipated? But what we also find is sort of this early period of Du Bois's life where you often hear about the talented 10th. So we learn a little bit more about how he framed sort of the progress of the race, and sort of thinking about what would it require for us as a people to sort of move forward and to progress. However, when we sort of think about the role of the American Negro Academy and the talented 10th, we know that there was a shift away from that in Du Bois's later life. And so the organization itself, ultimately closed in 1928 as a result of, as you see from the slide here, it was only open to men of African descent. And it was really only positioned to support folks who were considered high intellects and who were also invited to the space. And so as a result of sort of membership issues and a lot of different things related to what I might call elitism in this very early period, we see that the American Negro Academy no longer existed. However, it served a really important role with regard to some early considerations around what is it going to require to move the race forward. And then just a few years later, so initially I was going to spend most of my time today talking about the famous infographics that many of you might have seen with regard to Du Bois's work while he was at Atlanta University. And so during this first period of his time at Atlanta University, he was a professor of history and economics. And this series of data visualizations that you see here were really ahead of their time. And so when I was really thinking about what this work meant in the 1900s, as a result of not only the work that had been done prior to, and some of that work includes the lynching campaigns that were conducted by Ida B. Wells Barnett, as well as other sociologists across the world. And so Du Bois really took a global perspective to really consider how can I shift the narratives and discourses around people of African descent in the Americas. And so his work here in Atlanta would really go on to shift a lot of what we believed and thought at the time about African Americans. However, there was some other things that happened during that period. The death of his son in 1899. And there was a period in terms of the lynching. So I mentioned Ida B. Wells Barnett. There was a Sam Hose lynching campaign. And so at this period, we see a shift in sort of Du Bois' practices, more towards an early activism, and sort of really thinking about using campaigns and propaganda. He would talk later a lot about art. And so he begins in this period to write fiction. And this fiction and the stories that he wrote were very interesting in that they took a realist narrative and they shifted to some more futurist and otherworldly stories. And so we'll talk a little bit about one story in particular as we sort of think about his evolving philosophy of education. So for this next section, we'll look at futurity in the Black intellectual tradition, and we'll start with that story of Du Bois. And so I'm not sure how many of you have ever heard of the Prince's Steel. And so this was recently uncovered by a few researchers out of his archives. And he wrote quite a few stories. Some of them were never published. And one of them was the Prince's Steel. So this was written sometime between 1908 and 1910. And it was an earlier draft called the Megascope, A Tale of Tales. And so what we see here, building off of some of the work that Du Bois did in 1900s, especially with the publication of his work around the Philadelphia Negro, he's sort of taken his realism and he's sort of thinking about futurity and specifically the development of science and technologies to deal with the problem of the 20th century that he said, which is the color line. And so in this story, we learn about this professor, Hannibal Johnson, and he's conducting an experiment on the top of a Manhattan skyscraper, and he's using the megascope. And so this is an artist rendering of the megascope in the story. And so it's at the center of the story, and it really shifts what Hannibal Johnson, the sociologist professor, is doing. He's sort of looking at this narrative between warriors trying to capture princes whose hair is steel. And so as he's doing that work, he's really talking through the current racial struggles and also the work that's necessary to move us forward with regard to specifically the future. And so when we think about some of the expectations that he sort of situated in here, he talked a lot about the racial work, but he also introduces this sort of gendered narration. In particular, one of the observers, the wife of the protagonist, she's unable to see everything in the megascope. And so very early on, we see Du Bois really attacking and sort of questioning this sort of gendered narrative. And this is happening right around 1908 and 1910. And so if we look at that historical moment, we know there was a suffrage movement, and there was also the development of a lot of sororities and fraternities. And so there's a lot of shifting narratives taking place when Du Bois is considering this ideations of the future. So when we take a big picture view of future studies, sort of we think about where Du Bois was situated, I want to talk a bit about future methodologies and how we're going to think about Afrofuturism and what I would consider Du Bois as one of the earliest Afrofuturists of our time. And so in future methodologies, just generally we think about broader periods of time. So we go beyond 5 years, which is often how we think about policy and practice. And future methods really think about 5 to 50 years. And so in The Prince's Steel, Du Bois is really situating this narrative around 100 years in the past and 100 years in the future. There's also a part of future studies that considers participatory practices and how these practices sort of shift these power dynamics. And in this period of Du Bois's life, when he's writing this work, we sort of see something similar in terms of these shifts between power structures. So he's working with the NAACP, he's editing The Crisis a few years later when he starts that work. And so we see a lot of his shifts in terms of his broader philosophy of work, life, and also the African-American experience. It also engages different ways of knowing. And so when we think about future studies, we're also thinking about media, culture, and technology. And when we sort of consider what that does to learning, it really challenges traditional learning practices. And so if we look at the infographics that Du Bois created with his students for the Paris Exposition in 1900, and I'll just go back to those for a second. These were really ahead of their time. So briefly, I'll talk about two of the infographics. The first is the infographic related to free slaves and during the period of 1790 to 1870. I think the use of his color here and sort of making a statement for the world to really reconsider precisely how data and visualizations can really challenge what we think about racial justice. When you look at the second picture here with the proportion of the total population, so as the American population is growing, you also see a smaller embedded image of Black United States, sort of the population of African Americans at the time. And he's sort of creating this narrative using mathematics to challenge a few different things. One of those things was the fact that a lot of other smaller countries during the period had similar populations as to the African American population at the time. He's also showing us through this infographic a lot of different ways to consider not only the importance of the Black population to the United States, but also its growing in relevance to the work that's happening in the country. The last piece about future studies is they're action oriented. And so we often don't think about the future as being relevant to the present in terms of action. And so when we think about future studies as action oriented, it really poses this question about what is needed now for us to create these futures that we imagine. And one of the questions that we ask in terms of the work that's done in education, it's like, what does justice seek? So there's a lot of different researchers who sort of really look at the different ways and different communities that seek justice. And so two of those communities that we might think about are Indigenous Americans and African Americans. You have stolen people on stolen land. And we sort of reconsider the role of data science and the legacy of Du Bois, we really are able to expand the type of action orientations that we take on. Now, beyond future studies, we might think about Afrofuturism. And this is actually a very important impasse here, because it takes a critical race approach to the broader ideals that might be approached in future studies. And so Afrofuturism is it's an aesthetic. And so we've all heard Afrofuturist sounds, we've seen Afrofuturist images. And so when we think about it within the academy, we might consider some of the early work of, for example, critical race theorist Derek Bell. And so his early writings on the space traders really position Afrofuturism in context of law and public policy. And so some of that academic work was expanded by Alondra Nelson and others in a special issue of Social Text. And in that space, they really question how we consider the role of Afrofuturism, not just in the academic space, but also in terms of our policy and practice outside of it. And so when we think beyond the academy, we're sort of seeing this engagement across music, art, and writing. And so when we begin to think more about interdisciplinary education, my hope is that we're seeing a merging of this space. So we don't have this academic soul space where we're looking at, and then we have an outside of the academy space. When we marry the Afrofuturist sort of ideals and traditions to some of historical work around African-American scholars. So we're thinking about not only just the work of Du Bois at this time, but also the work of African-American scholars within the United States and beyond. We begin to look at the Black intellectual tradition. So Manny Marable posits this Black intellectual tradition as a really important role of advancing how we think about, how we understand, and how we posit new futures for Black people and the world writ large. So he notes that there's three important parts of the Black intellectual tradition across time and space. And so that first is that the Black traditions are descriptive. And so they present the realities of Black life. And so if we think back to the early work of Du Bois, and specifically his work focused on removing the veil and this idea of double consciousness, we sort of think about the role of presenting the realities of Black life at the period to really shift the narrative around African Americans in the United States. Marable also says that these traditions are corrective, and so that they challenge mainstream discourses. And so when we really look at what it means to be corrective in this way, we sort of think about Africana education. We look at a lot of historically Black colleges and universities, the African American history departments, women's studies, and a lot of the role of these institutions and these departments are correcting a traditionally Eurocentric education that doesn't challenge the role of race, class, and culture and inequities. And lastly, Manny Marable says that the Black intellectual traditions are prescriptive. And so they envision practices to empower Black people. And so it's at this point that we sort of think about futurity. And I want to make a note in terms of some of the work of Saidiya Hartman, the afterlife of slavery, specifically in Lose Your Mother, A Journey Along the Atlantic Slave Route. And so she talks about the dispossession and statelessness of Black people and a collective of dark bodies in America in the global context. You really see this merging of history and futurity in terms of our thinking about Black identity. So we might consider some of the work of James Baldwin, who talks a lot about our identity development across time and race and identity in America, and he uses stories to really get us there. And so part of that prescription is really asking critical questions and saying, well, what is it going to require for us to envision the future? And so I'll spend most of the time today thinking about this move towards critical interdisciplinary education. So we've spent most of the last year on Zoom teaching. And so I'm really interested in terms of my discourse today in challenging how do we think about the legacy of Du Bois, his data science work, his education, his training. How do we begin to look at that in terms of our work with students today? And so I'm going to start a bit with some of my own work on Afrofuturism in mathematics and some of the key questions that we're considering. And that first question again is, what does justice seek? And so we're really looking at for which communities and what types of justices are necessary for us to move forward to some new futures where liberation is possible and it's realized. We also want to think about how mathematics, so in this paper that you see here, this chapter that I wrote, it's really the story of asking, what will we use mathematics for in the future? And how can we begin to get young people to understand that in terms of the world and the universe? And when it comes to data science, so there's this shift between statistics and statistical analyses and also data science. So the questions that we ask are related to what type of statistical analyses or data sciences will we be conducting 100 years into the future? And finally, what does justice look like for the African American? And so I find this question really interesting because we're in the United States, one of the largest capitalist nations in the world, who was founded on racial violence. And so the role of the African American, not only in the development of the country, but also in the future of the country, becomes sort of a question when we consider technology and this Afrofuturism when it considers cultural and transnational sort of ways of thinking. And so where does this sort of sit in terms of sort of theoretical bases? And so I show you this Time magazine cover from the 80s. And it's this sort of discussion between the rule and the exception. And we often hear these narratives around Asians are good at math, and then the exception that Black people are bad at math. But what I want us to notice is within either of those discussions, whiteness is normalized. And so when we think about the role of Afrofuturism, sort of in following the legacy and the future work of Du Bois, we really get to this impasse of critiquing not just whiteness, but also the role of sort of these battles between communities and how some of the later work in the evolution of Du Bois really had us consider collaborative work and social justice movements across spaces. And so what this looks like for some of the students in math now really is situated around what you see here, some local work. And so this is a project that students, high school students in Atlanta high schools conducted a few years ago. And it's focused around considering the role of math and data in challenging current ideologies with regard to gerrymandering, the separation of communities, gentrification, and redlining. Another project that students look at is related to population and homelessness. So when we sort of think about the role of math and how math plays a role here, it gives the students an opportunity to really engage in a critical and focused analysis of society based on what they see mathematically. So I mentioned those to sort of think about Du Bois's broader philosophy of education. And so in a paper that he wrote in 1973, he talks through three particular portions of what he believes to be an important component of education. And so that first is a critical knowledge of the past. And so he says that without this critical knowledge of the past, and particularly Africana education, there's no work to be done. You have to sort of know your history. And so as I think about this interdisciplinary practice and what the role of data science here is, we really can use some of the evidence that Du Bois found to really shift how we're doing in terms of our knowledge production and development. And so you might see some of the work of others in R. They're using some of the statistical programs to reconsider how we can recreate some of the infographics that Du Bois developed. He also talks about the importance of understanding injustices across the world. That second component that he talks about is related to cultural knowledge. And so he says there needs to be a critical cultural inquiry. And so in those inquiries, he talks specifically about the importance of not only just a critical knowledge of the past, but what's happening in the moment. And so as he says that, he's looking at culture within and beyond the Americas and relating that specifically to the role of Africans and African Americans across the world and how that cultural knowledge really positions, again, that identity development that's necessary in the quest for education. And lastly, related to this sort of idea of futurity, he talks about the study of the present and future needs. And he talks about humanity overall as sort of a result of this process. And so there's this role of a specificity that Du Bois situates. He says, when you really take a close look at history and a close look at culture and a close look at particular communities, you really begin to challenge what justice is necessary for humanity overall. And so when we think about this idea of futurity, we sort of have these different images, music, visual media, and culture, to really think about a practice of possibility. And so really what this interdisciplinary practice shifts us towards is considering what's possible. And so no longer are we thinking about one of these early questions that Du Bois asks. He says, what does it mean to be a problem? I think as we sort of shift towards different policies and practices happening, we're looking at what is possible for the future. And when we sort of think about the role of data science there's a few different ways that we might consider that. Currently, data science in the sort of the traditional status quo way really considers computational mathematics, statistics, and methods that are not really rooted in historical analyses that we learn from Du Bois. And so when we sort of think about the role of a critical interdisciplinary data science, and specifically for racial justice, here's what we might think about. First, when we consider critical education, Black studies and ethnic studies. And so recently in California, ethnic studies was implemented as a law in a lot of different schools. And so there is a future where we no longer have to situate learning around Eurocentric narratives in the K-12 space. So we see this happening in post-secondary spaces, but we might not consider what that looks like in K-12. You'll notice in those early stories of Du Bois, he begins, with the American Negro Academy, they're not letting women in. And then he challenges that later in that early story of The Apprentice Still by noting the differences in terms of the establishment and the denial of women as equal. And so when we think about any interdisciplinary education, we really want to make sure that we're considering women and gender studies. And so it makes me think about Kimberly Crenshaw and her work around intersectionality. And she talks a lot about post-racial pragmatism as well. And so she says that one might call it assimilationist, one might call it simply an effort to deliver something on race with the existing ideological and political constraints, rather than trying to push at those constraints. And so when we think about post-racial pragmatism in the context of, for Kimberly Crenshaw, intersectionality, we're really challenging how history has taken male privilege and white privilege and really done a disservice in particular to Black women and women more generally. We also want to think about queer studies and the LGBTQ community, and in particular, how this has us consider the margins. So we hear a lot in the world today around the marginalized communities beyond race, beyond class. And so when we sort of think about different fields of study, as we consider data science, it becomes important to consider what it means for us to look at queer studies. Fourthly, we want to look at disability studies. So there's a lot of work coming out in education that's really shifting our narratives around disability studies. So as we think a little bit further about disability studies, what does it mean for this to work in data science? So how does data science have us critique, but also how can it advance disability studies in terms of the broader role of critical education? Now, more traditional forms of math and the computational sciences are obviously going to be a part of a data science education. So as we sort of think about data science, we might not only consider it as a method, but also as a framework. And so how can we use a critical data science and an interdisciplinary data science to really reframe the role of math and the computational sciences? So I think about some of the work that young people, both here in Atlanta and across the world, have done as a result of critically engaging in what we call teaching and learning mathematics for social justice. And so scholars in that field really look at, well, how can mathematics be used to really expand not only youth's knowledge around the world, but also to put them to action. And so again, in sort of Du Bois's evolving philosophy of education, he draws closer and closer to action. So the question that we might ask is, how can math and science move us closer to action, and action specifically for racial justice? We also want to think about qualitative research. And so data science is a part of a broader goal of racial justice. And so when we think about the telling of stories and qualitative research, we really begin to engage the stories of youth, families, and communities, which was a really foundational part, not only of the historical work of African Americans and the Black historical tradition, but also more generally in the fight towards justice. And it makes me think about Chimamanda Adichie's story around the danger of a single story, and how, if you tell someone or you allow someone to tell the same story again and again, we begin to see a community of people singularly. And then lastly, those future studies, and specifically Afrofuturism, and considering how we can engage students in the practice of imagining new worlds. So this goes back to the idea of possibilities, Afrofuturism as a practice of possibility. And so when we consider, again, the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, he's positioned data science in a way for us to imagine new futures. He shifted discourses there. And so one of the questions that we might consider around the work that we do with young people is, how can this work become a piece of them considering futures and new futures where their voices, their desires, and also their futures are able to realize justice and equity. I wanted to end today, I know that we have a few minutes left, with a video that I found around this question, this problem. And I think it sort of situates some of the possibilities in terms of us moving forward towards interdisciplinarity.
Between me and the other world, there is ever an unasked question. Unasked by some through feelings of delicacy, by others through the difficulty of rightly framing it. Instead of saying directly, "How does it feel to be a problem?" they say, "I know an excellent colored man in my town." Or, "Do not these southern outrages make your blood boil?" At these I smile, or reduce the boiling to a simmer, as the occasion may require. To the real question, how does it feel to be a problem, I answer seldom a word. And yet being a problem is a strange experience. It dawned upon me with a certain suddenness that I was different from the others, shut out from their world by a vast veil. For the world I longed for and all its dazzling opportunities were theirs, not mine. Why did God make me an outcast and a stranger in mine own house? It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at one's self through the eyes of others. One feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro. Two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. The history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. In the days of bondage, they thought to see in one divine event the end of all doubt and disappointment. Slavery was, indeed, the sum of all villainies, the cause of all sorrow, the root of all prejudice. Emancipation was the key to a promised land of sweeter beauty than ever stretched before the eyes of wearied Israelites. Years have passed away, 10, 20, 30, and yet, the freed man has not yet found in freedom his promised land. Merely a stern concrete test of the underlying principles of the Great Republic is the Negro problem. And the spiritual striving of the freedmen's sons is the travail of souls whose burden is almost beyond the measure of their strength, but who bear it in the name of an historic race, in the name of this, the land of their fathers' fathers, and in the name of human opportunity.
So again, as we think about some of the key questions that Du Bois situated for our study and future work, I want to come back to the Black intellectual tradition and think about how data science specifically can help us to be descriptive, corrective, and prescriptive. And as we think about, again, the identity development and the role of education, not simply education in the university space, but education within our communities, education within our families, and also education broadly across the world for the goal of humanity. I think we really learn a lot about what Du Bois did while he was in Atlanta University, but also across his lifetime. And so as I think about interdisciplinary education, Du Bois was one of those folks who really situated a lot of different areas of study. And those areas of study really moved us towards ways of thinking about the future. And I hope as we sort of leave this moment, as we all prepare to return to our schools, to return to our workplaces, as we deal with the COVID-19 sort of the impact of COVID-19 on education, and as we consider possibilities for the future, we don't have to go back to where we were. We really have an opportunity to shift and think about the historical role of not only research, but also visionary thinking of our young people and of ourselves for the future. And so I'll leave you with the Black intellectual tradition sort of as a broad sort of scope of considering, again, how Du Bois himself and all of the work that he considered, both in sociology and history, economics and data, science and statistics, how he was descriptive, corrective, and prescriptive. And I challenge us all to consider ways of integrating this into our work so that we can really shift new futures towards a practice of possibility. Thank you again for your time today, and I hope everyone has a great weekend.
Thank you, Dr. Alexander. That was a really insightful presentation. You can stop sharing your screen at this time. We're going to move into a Q&A. If anybody has questions, if you put them anywhere, I will see them and I will relay them to Dr. Alexander. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A or the chat and I will grab them. So Dr. Alexander, your presentation was very insightful and deep and moving. We're all still unpacking the Derek Chauvin verdict and the death of George Floyd. And it's really challenging multiple communities, I'll say it that way, to really think how we are either contributing to or building new ways in which we can all coexist and not have systems, in particular in data science, that negatively impact one race or gender or whatever classification or another. Thinking futuristically in data science, what are some of your thoughts about what we need to keep in mind so we can dismantle some of this racism that has been embedded in certain data science systems, and how can we move forward?
Yeah, I think about, that's a really good question. And thank you again, Dr. Washington. You know, my students and I are looking at some of the work by Ida B. Wells Barnett around the lynching campaigns and some of the early sort of advocacy. And so I found a connection between both her disagreement with some of the work of Du Bois, but also their establishment of considering propaganda in art. And so when I think about the role of data science and sort of what it plays in terms of math and science, and how we sort of situate things across disciplines, I think history tells us that we have to work, we have to integrate a lot of that. So true interdisciplinary thinking, I think, is the way forward. And so as I think about what that looks like in practice, who takes the challenge to dismantle some of the potential disciplinary boundaries that we work in isolation? And how can that sort of broaden sort of our investigations of racial justice, gender injustice, as we think about a lot of different of the injustices that we see, class injustice as well, when we begin to really collaborate truly in an interdisciplinary matter and not just in our silos.
Yeah, it's one of the things I like about Du Bois. He comes as a sociologist, but that didn't limit how and what he did, what he did. And he created, the Du Bois spiral and other novel data visualizations to tell our story, which really reflects that data science is not just housed only in STEM or just housed only in one area. It really does hit across the disciplines. So how well are we talking across the disciplines about data science, the role that data science plays, and what can we do to facilitate that crosstalk?
I think it's happening in a few different areas. I think as data science broadens, as a new way of thinking about engaging education, I think there are a lot of folks trying in this moment to integrate history into that practice. My concern is, are we looking at what our ancestors and others have done in the past? And so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And so when I talked about Afrofuturism and sort of that academic work and outside of the academy, part of the academy's role is to innovate or to sort of find your niche. And so when I think about data science broadly, it goes beyond that. It sort of transcends the disciplines. And so I think I think that people are considering the role of history and the future, but also I think some of the work that's happening is considering the practices that are necessary to move us to action. So as we sort of think about the racial injustices of just the last year, I know the Washington Post has put up a bunch of data on all of the fatal police shootings in the United States. And so there's a few different ways to, look at that data. And I think data science with sort of the historical and the futurist narratives really pushes a lot of folks to consider new ways of looking at stuff beyond just statistical analyses or, again, this more isolated way of thinking about the use of data.
And somebody put in the chat, they said, The Philadelphia Negro is one of the most remarkable books I've ever read. How impressed are you at this remarkable census-like study Du Bois was able to do before the turn of the century with no computer, no internet, no modem, no cell phone, no tablet? It's phenomenal.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I wanted to be an architect at one point in my life. So I really like design and, I like drawing. And I think when I look at Du Bois's later work, so this science fiction work that I talked about, The Prince of Steel, he read a lot of fiction and he wrote a lot of fiction. Not all of it was published. And so I think what that tells many of us, and sort of what I've read through some of the archives, is that when he was establishing things like the Philadelphia Negro and sort of doing that study, he's not approaching this just as a researcher, just as a sociologist, like you said. He's really considering a lot of different inputs. And I think, the 7th Ward in Philadelphia at the time, no one had ever done a study like that. And so he's not just establishing new methods, he was conducting the first study that had ever been done like that across the world in the United States. And I think it really was informed by, I think he was a polymath. He did a lot of different things. And so that study is really amazing. And I think it sort of set a foundation to what we saw him do across his lifetime.
That's great. And as you said, he was a professor here at Atlanta University. Clark College merged with Atlanta University. we'll say not too long ago. So hopefully we are carrying on his tradition here. But could you share with us your background and
Oh, yeah.
what is that in your background?
So this is, if you can see, this is the long walk. This is Atlanta University back in the day. And so this is an image that I found on the internet while I was doing, so I do a lot of archival work. I didn't really talk about it a lot during the talk. I've recently gotten interested in a lot of the archival work, looking at some of the work of Du Bois. And so this is Atlanta University in the long walk. So if you've been to campus, you might recognize that there's more buildings there now, but this is actually the Atlanta University. If you sort of come through, if you come through from the Morehouse side and sort of think about where the new streets are, you'll see some of the new construction there and what this was back then.
Neat. So Atlanta University at one time, it was the graduate only program.
Yep.
And they had a lot of, still do, have a lot of hardcore researchers. And yeah, so it's just phenomenal. And I hear the bells outside my window are chiming. So thank you, Dr. Alexander, for giving us this thought-provoking, insightful presentation on Du Bois's work that really leveraged data science to get the society to think about dismantling racism, to address social justice for all. And, you know, I just want to give one quote from Du Bois. It was, "Believe in life. Always human beings will progress to great, broader, and fuller life." So we proceed all together in the spirit of Du Bois. So
yes.
Thanks again, Dr. Alexander.
Thank you again to the Data Science Initiative, the AUC Data Science Initiative, and to you, Dr. Washington, and your team, and everyone in the AUC.
Thank you so much. So with that, we are going to transition to the closing remarks at the end of this great inaugural Data Science Symposium, W.E.B. Du Bois Data Science Symposium. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Jerry Volsey, who is the fantastic Deputy Director of the AUC Data Science Initiative. Dr. Volsey?
Thank you. A great symposium indeed it was. And Dr. Alexander, thank you. What a fitting tribute to Du Bois's legacy, and what a fitting bookend to a great symposium that carries out his work. So I find myself in the precarious position of standing between an audience exhausted from information overload and the weekend. I'm aware of that, so I'll be brief. You're welcome. So data science has taken on such an important role in our lives. It drives decisions that affects us personally, drives decisions that affect our communities, our country, and indeed the entire world. W.E.B. Du Bois understood the power of data. Dr. Alexander showed the extent of his insights. Yet, even Du Bois probably couldn't have conceived of how data would leverage computing technology, the Internet of Things, the free flow of information on the information superhighway, and how it would transform the world we live in just some 50-odd years after his passing. Data drives decisions about public resource allocations that have historically marginalized the very communities Du Bois fought for. In Du Bois's day, the push was for numeric representation, where decisions were being made. Today, that's not enough. Today, we need data literate representatives in order for them to be effective. We need decision makers who understand that technologies like machine learning, it's predictive, it can forecast, it can do wonderful things, but that the data upon which it relies carries the scars and the marks of the bias, the bigotry, the prejudices of the time when that data was actually created. It has all the marks of its turbulent past. That time wasn't one that was very favorable for African Americans. And therefore, we have to understand the limits of what this data can do for us as we're using it to predict and make decisions about the future. This is why our work here with the symposium and at the Data Science Initiative is so pressing. It's important for our students, their future. It's important for our community. It's important for our country. The Data Science Symposium is a nod to the work begun by Du Bois, but this is only the beginning. There's a new urgency to that work brought about by the technologies that have propelled data science really center stage these days. The 2021 Symposium is not only the beginning, is only the beginning of our response to the challenge before us. And that is one of how do we increase the number and representation of data literate African Americans who are in the rooms where decisions are being made, decisions that affect us, all of us, every race, every creed, where those decisions are being made. W.E.B. Du Bois was born in February of 1868. Our inaugural symposium for 2020 was in April, but that's a matter of logistics. In the years to come, we will be hosting the symposium in August, closer to Du Bois's birthday. And the 2022 symposium will build upon what we've learned this year and will be even better. And every symposium thereafter, we expect will just be an improvement on the one before. So I'll stop here with my remarks, but I want to again thank our keynote speakers, Dr. Sean Jones, Dr. Nathan Alexander. Sean and I go back a good way, so we'll have to reconnect. I'm not sure if he's still in the session here. Nathan, keep the faith, keep that candle of Du Bois's memory burning. That was very powerful. Let me also thank our panelists. You're too numerous to name, but you know who you are. Our guests, Mayor Keisha Lance Bottom, Congressman Jerry McNerney. Your support is appreciated. And of course, you, our conference participants, without whom none of this really makes any sense. Of course, the symposium itself couldn't be possible without the generosity of our sponsors and industry partners, and there are many of them: the United Health Group, Coca-Cola, SAP, IBM, the Sloan Foundation, Microsoft. Hopefully I'm not missing anyone, but if I am, we thank you equally. And last, I have to acknowledge the AUC Data Science Initiative team for pulling this together. It is a skeleton staff, it's a skeleton crew. It's tiny, but it's mighty. And it is a pleasure to be counted among your colleagues. Director Washington, your leadership, along with the other members of the team, Bettina, Tommy, Judy, Nora, Michael, and a number of graduate students, Joy, Cameron, Lake, Amber. And I understand that we have graduate students from outside the AUC. I'm sorry, I don't have your names, but all of you involved in putting this together, you all deserve a big round of applause. I'm giving you a virtual applause. For everyone else, I hope that you have found this symposium to be as informative as I have. I'm on information overload. I've got pages of notes that I'm going to be taking with me. And I am hopeful that we will see you next year when we do this again. And so with that, I bid you all farewell. Be well, be safe. Follow us on social media so that you don't miss out on the future programming that we will offer.
Thank you so much, Dr. Volsi, for those closing remarks. Just want to remind everything, just some housekeeping. If you could provide feedback on our survey, because as Dr. Volsi said, we will have another Du Bois Data Science Symposium next year in February, right around his birthday. Depending on how the pandemic goes, we might even have some cake. Well, you know, either virtually or literally. So mark your calendars, we will have this again. In September, we anticipate having a symposium for students, targeted towards students, where students will have the opportunity to present. So really looking forward to that in September. So stay engaged with us with the Data Science Initiative. We're still building, expanding. Come hang out with us and let's do some data science together. Thanks again, everyone.
Bye all.